and then they are eligible for a hearing and parole. And that we don't do that. That you
No.
get a life sentence, that's what it is. And the
Yeah.
only country that actually life without parole, where it means life without parole, other than us, is Holland. I found that fascinating that Holland was the exception. But so, yeah, what you're saying is extremely disturbing to think that
Yeah.
we are not more progressive as we should be, as we should be. So, so then when you were in prison, you did not expect to ever leave. Is that accurate?
No, I did not actually. And in fact,
Right.
I had come to the conclusion probably when had been in around 20 years, maybe a little bit less than that. I came to the conclusion that it was fruitless to ever hope that I was going to get out. And in fact, it was painful and it was counterproductive in many ways. And I pretty much just came to the conclusion, this is it, this is my life. And that's when I really set out to do the best that I could to make positive change from where I lived, instead of waiting around for some hopeful future that probably wouldn't ever happen.
And what were those changes? Because I talk about you as an activist. Would you consider yourself an activist in prison while you were there?
Yeah, I guess I mean, while I was doing it, I don't know if I would have considered myself an activist per se, but I did. The California prison system did lock me up in what we called the hole, what people on the outside often call solitary confinement or administrative segregation. I went to the hole 9 times for political activities. So I assumed that would qualify me as an activist.
I would think so. What were what were some of the activities that the prison system objected to and then put you in the box?
Let's say I'll give you a couple of examples that I think are pretty illustrative. One time I testified at a federal trial that was held on the grounds of the prison I was then housed in. And I was asked by a magistrate judge after being sworn in to testify. He said, do they ever make you stand outside in the rain or the snow, in the cold and the wind to get your medication? They were investigating medical procedures at the prison. And I said, yeah, they do that all the time. And he kind of looked a little surprised. And he said, well, what if I was to tell you that an official of this prison testified under oath that they don't ever do that? And I just said, without any hesitation, said, well, whoever said that's a liar. What I didn't know was the person who had actually testified to that was sitting in the room when I said that. and I knew almost immediately because I saw this particular person's face turn bright red. And I thought to myself, that's the person who said it. And a few days later, I was in the hole on a trumped up charge of inciting without any other thing, just inciting, which I've never could really figure out what that actually meant. But so that was one time. Another time I was put in the hole because myself, assisted with some wonderful activist folks on the outside, I wrote a thing called the Road to Rehabilitation, the honor program, the Road to Rehabilitation. It was about a program I helped create at Lancaster Prison. And we sort of sent this pamphlet that we had created, had published. We sent it to every single member of the legislature, the governor's office, every warden of every prison in California, and a lot of the members of the media at exactly the same time on the same day. And they put me in the hole for being in possession of confidential information, and the confidential information was statistics that they published on their own website that were mailed into. So there's a couple of good examples of, they were just mad, that I was telling the truth about what they were doing.
That's right. Now, you mentioned the honor program that you created. Can you tell us a little bit about what that is?
Sure. And I want to be clear, I co-created it. There were many other folks involved. I wrote the original proposal, but there were a lot of people involved at various levels. But yeah, it was called the honor program originally. In a nutshell, it sort of created an environment on one facility at the prison, California State Prison, Los Angeles County in Lancaster, California, where to participate in the program, you had to sign a contract that said that you would disavow racial stuff, drugs, gang politics, all the dumb stuff that, is rampant in, the hyper-masculine reality of prisons in California. And it created a yard that was essentially violence-free within 30 days, that prior to that had been having a riot about once a month. And it was, to this day, to the best of my knowledge, the most successful program of its kind ever launched in California. And of course, it was resisted enormously by the prison system because I think they assumed it wouldn't work. And we were very lucky. There was a man named Ernie Rowe, who was the warden at the time. He was a really good man. He's since passed away, and may he rest in peace. He was a really good man, and he said, you know what, let's give this a try. Maybe it'll work. And I think all the other people running things were like, well, this will never work, because they basically viewed us as animals, frankly. Mm-hmm. And what they didn't accept was that if you treat people like animals, sometimes they act poorly, which is not really a shock to anyone who's ever took a first-year psychology class. But for some reason, it seems to endlessly surprise people who run prisons. And like I say, it became a model for the California prison system that all along was undermined and was really, really hated by the people who ran the system, because I think they looked at it as fundamentally, it was created by folks in prison, and it made them look really bad because it proved that if you just treated people a little bit better, they'd act better.
You would think they would be grateful and appreciative about a program that brings violence down, wouldn't you?
Well, I think the issue here is it's kind of like this. The problem, I believe, is that the prison system has a perverse incentive. If everything was to run perfectly and the recidivism rate was to turn to zero and people would stop committing additional crimes, the prison system would go out of business.
Right.
And the prison system is a massive bureaucracy in the United States. It's well over $100 billion a year. It's about 15 billion, 14 billion a year in this state alone. Gee. And it supports a lot of jobs. It supports a lot of industries who provide things to the prison system. At the end of the day, it's not a good thing. And like my father, who was in the Navy for 30 years, often said, the first job of every bureaucracy is to grow. So
they're very interesting. Yeah. Now, the honor program, was it adopted in other state prisons in California?
Well, it's an interesting story there. It never was formally adopted in any other prison in California. At one point, we had achieved enough friends in the legislature I actually wrote the language for a bill that passed by bipartisan majorities of both houses of the California legislature that would have mandated honor programs in all medium and maximum security prisons in California. And the prison system behind the scenes convinced then Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger that we didn't need legislation. We could do this on our own. Those were their words. Ultimately, they created a kind of a sham program called the Enhanced Programming Facilities. Did not provide any of the incentives to positive programming that we did with the honor program, and they all failed within a year or two. And they still haven't done anything like that to this day.
We're talking about programs. Were there any prison-initiated support programs that you saw as beneficial?
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, yes. And I think my answer to that would be, there are, in fact, people who work in the prison system who are decent human beings. There are people who come in here who try to do good. It's a terrible system that is harmful to all human beings who encounter it, including the people in the suits and the uniforms. But yeah, I ran into programs along the way that were initiated by the prison system, some of which were pretty useful. Most of the programs that I participated in that were actually useful were not initiated by the prison system. They usually came from well-meaning groups. In California, they're called community-based organizations often. And they would bring in programs that were much more rehabilitation oriented and much more about healing and trauma informed and those kinds of things.
I see. All right. There was I don't know if I call it a program, the conjugal visits, but we are almost out of time here. So what I would like to do, Ken, is have you return and talk to us again. There's so much that you have to say after all the decades that you've been in prison. So would you be willing to do that? Come back?
Absolutely, Harriet. I'd love to come back.
Oh,
Sounds like
that's
fun.
great. All right, wonderful. All right, so we will see our we will be with our listening audience, I guess you could say, for next time when Ken Hartman will come back and be our guest again. And thank you so much today for listening. See you next time.